September 10th, 2001, 10:07 a.m. EDT, Columbus, Ohio. Nahid, what are you doing? We're going to be late for science. Eliza had walked past and been heading down the hallway when she stopped and looked back. Nahid was fiddling with her locker. The combination had to be dialed and clicked in perfectly, or it didn't open, and if you had to start all over, this was probably why most kids just carried their books around with them all day. There wasn't enough time between periods anyway, even when your locker was cooperating. I need my science book. Nahid didn't take her eyes off the lock. Starting over. 25, 15, 32. That was the number, wasn't it? You go ahead. Don't worry about me, Nahid told Eliza. In fact, please go ahead. For some reason, even though Nahid and Eliza had never been friends before, Eliza had attached herself to Nahid this year, sort of like a new puppy, and sort of in a reciprocal way, even though it was annoying. Nahid didn't mind, because 6th grade was so much more confusing than 5th had been, and as strange as she was, Eliza seemed to know what to do and where to go in this unfamiliar maze of hallways and classrooms. At the same time, Nahid really didn't want to stand out any more than she already did, because she was Muslim and because she wore a headscarf. And right now, Eliza wasn't helping that cause. No, really, Nahid said, focusing harder on her locker. Just go. You'll be late. Eliza took the heavy steps back toward Nahid. No, I'll wait. You probably need me to show you the way. That was nice of Eliza, even if Nahid wished she wouldn't stand so close. Everyone knew Eliza was a little weird. She wasn't too clear on personal space, but the funny thing was, up until this year, no one had really cared. Or if they did, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Then middle school started last week, and everything felt different, as if you suddenly realized you had been coming to school in your pajamas, and you had to figure out a way to hide this fact before anyone else noticed. It seemed Eliza wasn't going anywhere until Nahid finally got her locker to pop open and yanked out her science book. Okay, let's go. Nahid hurried down the hall with Eliza, and just before Mrs. Salinger could close her classroom door, they managed to slip inside and drop into their seats. Nice you could join us, girls, Mrs. Salinger walked over to her place behind her desk. As I was saying, we're going to use the scientific method to test these hypotheses. After every experiment, you will be required to write up your results. Mrs. Salinger stood up, a stack of papers in her arms. Here is the format you will be expected to follow. Eliza's hand shot up. Can we work in pairs? That was her question every time. Yes, Mrs. Salinger answered. If gambling were allowed in her religion, which it was not, Nahid would have bet what was coming next. Because lately it seemed that the universe was conspiring against her. In fact, just that morning, Nahid had gone to pour her favorite cereal, only to find out her sister had eaten the last of it. But in the short run, what she ate for breakfast wasn't going to be the deciding factor. Nope. Surviving middle school seemed to be predicated solely on who your friends were and weren't. Sure enough, Mrs. Salinger went on. And I have already chosen the pairs, so don't bother begging. In fact, don't ask. The pairs are listed at the top of this sheet. But Mrs. Salinger, Eliza kept going, didn't she know resistance was futile? Mrs. Salinger just ignored her. Take one and pass it back, she said. She counted out exactly the number needed for each row of seats. It wasn't that Eliza was so awful or anything. She just talked a lot, and especially when she had nothing interesting or important to say. And she said things that were really odd, things most people only thought but knew better than to say out loud. Now this year, there was a whole batch of new kids from different elementary schools combined, and Nahid swore she could feel everyone jockeying for position, like horses on a racetrack. The truth was, Eliza didn't have any real friends, and because associated with her wasn't going to put Nahid anywhere near the head of the pack. But the harder Nahid prayed to Allah that her name wouldn't be coupled with anyone else, the more sure she was that Eliza's name and hers would be on the list side by side. Because it was a selfish prayer, and selfish prayers didn't get answered. A second later, it was confirmed when Nahid was handed the worksheet. Pair 7, Nahid Mohammad Adi, and Eliza Grayson. Mrs. Salinger said, "You will need to come up with an experiment as a pair, run your experiment as a pair, and write up your results." "Do we have to be in pairs?" one boy shouted out from the back of the room. Mrs. Salinger ignored him. "Come up with your experiment as a pair," she repeated it as if she hadn't heard him at all. She wrote the first hypothesis on the board. Sensitivity is heightened on your dominant side. There was a short discussion as to what dominant side meant. No, not who was bossier, not who weighed more. No, it was meant to determine if you were right-brained or left-brained, usually connoted by handedness. All that the pairs were expected to do today was to come up with their experiment. Tuesday, they would have to get them approved. They had the rest of the week to implement their experiments, and by Friday, their final reports were due. Chairs and desks were shifted around so the pairs could work together. Finally, everyone was settled and ready to begin. Sort of. Well, what is your dominant side, Nahid? What kind of name is Nahid Anyway, I've never known anyone with that name. It was starting right away, like it always did with Eliza. You would think that she was really lonely and had been storing up all these questions so she could make friends, only she'd ask the exact thing that made people not want to be friends with her. She wasn't anything like Nuri, but nonetheless, she made Nahid think about her sister. Maybe people felt that way about Nuri, too. Whenever someone asked Nuri something about being Islamic, she sprang into action like she was a Sunday school teacher. It wasn't that Nahid was ashamed of her religion or her family, but she didn't need to wear her beliefs on her sleeve, or her head, any more than she already did. "It's a perfectly normal name," Nahid answered. She could practically hear her sister's voice in her head. "Nahid is a Persian name. It means honorable and blameless. Our family is not Arabic, but we are Muslim. We follow the practice of Islam. A lot of people think those two words mean the same thing, but they don't." Always teaching. "We are Muslim and we follow Islam. It's like saying you're a Christian and you practice Christianity. Does that make sense?" Enough already. Nahid knew that she too had probably sounded exactly that way when she was 9 and had first started wearing the hijab. Habib, there we go. It showed that we are modest, that we are not looking for attention. It shows our devotion and loyalty to Islam. It's a command from Allah. It was just that lately Nahid felt that wearing her habib was more like showing she was different from everyone else. She certainly didn't need to explain it everywhere she went. "I didn't say it wasn't normal," Eliza went on. "I just said I never heard it before, and I wondered what the etymology of your name is." "The what?" "The origin of my name is Hebrew. It comes from Elizabeth, which means pledged to God. Do you believe in God?" "I think we better stick to the experiment," Nahid said, and she opened her notebook. "Any thoughts? I think maybe try pricking people's finger with a pin or pinching them really hard and seeing which hand hurts more." "That's not very scientific," Eliza answered. "Well, do you have any better ideas?" Sometimes Eliza did funny things with her face, tensing her mouth, blinking her eyes a lot. Nahid had never really noticed that before, but then again, she had never really spent this much time with Eliza or been this close. They had never had a class together. Eliza looked down at her hands. "I'm left-handed," she said. "Well, really I can use both hands, but I write with my left hand. I throw with my left hand, but I wink with my left eye. And if you are left-hand dominant, you are supposed to wink with your right." At the set of desks next to them, Tommy and Sebastian were wadding up pieces of paper and throwing them into a waste paper basket, using the left hand, then the right. Mrs. Salinger was pacing the room, but she stopped at their desk and asked the boys, "And exactly how does this indicate sensitivity?" Tommy had some explanation about shooting hoops, but Mrs. Salinger wasn't buying it, even though it sounded pretty reasonable to Nahid. "Try again, boys," Mrs. Salinger said. She tapped her watch. "You have exactly 8 minutes left." Nahid looked up at the clock over the doorway, the second hand snapping in rhythm. Now they had 7 minutes and 52 seconds. "Cold water," Nahid said suddenly. "Yeah, and we can time which hand you keep in the cold water longer, Eliza said. What do we need? A timer? And ice cubes in a big bowl? 6 minutes. Both girls were writing on their worksheets. Eliza looked up. She was done. She smiled at Nahid. Why do you wear that head covering? Nahid tried to ignore her. It had worked for Mrs. Salinger with that boy in the back of the room. She pretended she was still working on her worksheet. Huh? Why do you? Eliza continued a little louder, as if the reason Nahid hadn't answered had to do with the hearing problem. Is it the same as how my Nana keeps her head covered with a wig or a big scarf? She's Orthodox. Is it like that? Nahid looked around the room to see if anyone else was listening. She didn't want to talk about her Habib. Anyone else would have figured that out and stopped asking, but not Eliza. Next to them, Tommy and Sebastian were still balling up paper, although now they were using it like a stress ball and seeing which hand could squeeze it tighter. Do you have to wear it? Eliza went on. If Nahid didn't say something, the whole class was going to start looking this way, and just because they had seen Nahid's head covering for 3 years didn't mean they understood or didn't notice. But it was too late. Tommy and Sebastian seemed more interested in anything else than in their science experiment. Yeah, Nahid, why do you have to wear that? Isn't it hot under there? Tommy asked. It wasn't. Sebastian laughed. I remember in 3rd grade when you first wore it, I thought you had lost all your hair, like you were sick or something. Isn't that crazy? Yes. In fact, Nahid had long and very thick black hair. It was one of the things she loved about herself. It was just like her mother's. So why do you, Nahid? Eliza asked one more time. Wearing pajamas to school might have been better than this. The last thing she wanted to do was explain why. It was as if all of a sudden Nahid was a giant in the room with an endless skein of cotton on her head, and everyone was staring at her and it. I don't know, Eliza, Nahid said. Why do you have to be so annoying? Which seemed to do the trick. This question stopped, but it also sent Tommy and Sebastian into full-out hysterics. And then Eliza looked like she was about to cry. Annoying Eliza, Tommy laughed. That's a good one, Nahid. Eliza's mouth was twitching more than ever, and tears were filling up her eyes. Nahid had never seen anyone start to fall apart so quickly. Sebastian echoed the sentiment. Yeah, that's a good one. The boys said it in unison and repeated it a few times for good measure, like a Greek chorus. Annoying Eliza, annoying Eliza. The attention had shifted, and Nahid could feel herself returning to her normal size, but she also felt really bad. Eliza hadn't done anything wrong. She was just trying to make friends, and she just didn't know how. The boys were still laughing. 5 minutes left. Life science couldn't be over fast enough.